Good afternoon, Barry.
Hi, John. How you doing?
Well, except for that Wall Street Journal article last week talking about the latest attack on Tabor, for our viewers, that means the Taxpayer Bill of Rights that my colleague Barry was instrumental in creating. Some people have even called him the father of Tabor. I can tell by a smile on his face he's proud of that name. But yeah, it's an unrelenting attack on behalf of blue state big spending. Well, I have to say, my red state of Utah. They've been guilty of that too, having microscopic 5 point to the desk, 5 past the decimal point tax cuts so they can claim tax cuts while they increase spending faster than the rate of inflation plus population. So, yeah, the blue states are the worst offenders. And one of them, Colorado, has that Taxpayer Bill of Rights to restrain that impulse at least a little bit. And darn, it looks like Colorado is trying to follow the GAN spending limit playbook. What do you think, Barry?
Yeah,
That what it
that's
was?
exactly right. I think the education lobby is trying to do in Colorado exactly what they did in California, and Tabor is the most effective tax and spending limit in all the states. And what Tabor does is cap the growth of spending at inflation plus population growth and require that surplus revenue be rebated to taxpayers. And most importantly, it allows citizens to vote on any increase in taxes or debt. And what the education lobby put on the ballot in Colorado this year is a ballot measure that would essentially remove the limit because they would exempt education spending, which is the biggest part of state spending, and allow the state to spend surplus revenue. Well, once you do that, it's no longer an effective limit. And that's what happened in California. And the GAN amendment has not constrained any government spending since then. So it's especially disastrous this year as citizens are trying to cope with the problems of inflation and the cost of living. So it's the last thing that our government should be doing.
You know, and this represents another reason why people should be paying attention to our channel here at the Institute for Objective Policy Assessment, because a perspective that we have on it, I don't think anybody else is thinking about, namely with the unsustainable federal spending growth and debt, we need lean, mean state spending more than ever, because in the not overly distant future, we can't say exactly when, something that's unsustainable is going to end. And when that ends, 36% on average of state revenue is going to go away, probably. I mean, let's hope that federal spending, one of the first thing that it gets cut when it needs to be cut, is money given to states. Let's hope they cut defense last. So, you know, therein lies an assumption is that money going to states is going to be one of the first things that is cut when federal spending has to be cut, when there's no alternative because the bond buyers are getting skittish about keep buying $2 trillion more each year's worth of bonds because that's we're adding to the debt. So fiscal stress is going to come from the federal government to the states before long. It's in the last few years, it's been the opposite. I'm trying to remember what ARPA stands for, but anyway, the law granted a bunch of money from the feds who don't have any money other than the vast amount they're borrowing to states, most of whom are reasonably fiscally sound. And not only is that going to go away, but we're probably going to flip it into reverse as the federal government, when push comes to shove and the bond buyers get skittish, going to have to back away from supporting states. I know that was quite a ramble, Barry. Do you buy into that?
Oh, no, I agree. I think that, we're experiencing a tax revolt. I think people are fed up with unconstrained growth in government spending and inflation and the cost of living. And in many ways, we're in much worse shape than we were during the first tax revolt in the 1970s and 1980s that led to Tabor, because we have high rates of inflation, retardation in economic growth, and most importantly, we have unsustainable debt. Our debt now exceeds national income and is projected to continue to grow at an unsustainable rate. So in many ways, I think we're in worse shape in terms of the problems of inflation and unconstrained growth in government spending. And so I think it's even more important now for states to have tax and spending limits like TABOR at both the state and the local level. And let's be honest, we need a fiscal rule at the federal level similar to TABOR. So
we do.
I think we're working to achieve this. And in one of these podcasts, I'll talk about some of the new technology of petitioning that we are using to try to put measures on the ballot that would strengthen TABOR and have other states enact TABOR type limits. So there is some hope. There is some hope, especially in terms of improvements in the technology of voting and petitioning that could give direct democracy a huge boost. And I'll talk a little bit about those in another podcast because it gets into some rather technical questions about how do you vote now? Now we vote to vote on a petition. You have to sign a wet signature and you have to read some petition and work with some petitioner. Most people don't have time for that. So I'll talk a little bit about how we can improve that whole process.
Yeah, and we need those improvements in TABOR, especially given the federal situation. We need those large budget stabilization funds, rainy day funds, more than ever, because we need to have some money in there for states in our wonderful federal republic that choose to pick up some of those federally funded state programs, and others may not, but they need to have the fiscal capacity to consider doing that. Barry and I are not making an argument per se. We're small government guys, we'll confess, but we're not making that argument here. We're saying that the federal government is overextended, and so if people want to have certain programs that the federal government can no longer afford, they're going to have to do that at the state level. And to have the capacity to do that at the state level, they're going to need to have a tight fiscal situation, to say the least, and the capacity within taxpayer the spending limits, taxpayer bills of rights. Within that, they need the ability to expand if they choose to pick up some of those federal programs. So they need to go with leading circumstances.
I think that I remember back in the 1980s, I was at the Heritage Foundation, and President Reagan had downsized some federal programs. And it's interesting because when they basically said to the states, we can no longer fund these programs, the states simply dropped them because they weren't worth the state funding. When the state had to fund these programs from their own revenues, they eliminated some of them, privatized others, and kept only a few programs that were worth spending state money for. So obviously the federal government are wasting a lot of money, for sure, when the states do that.
Yeah, giving them programs that they wouldn't fund on their own if they had to raise it themselves, if they did have to pay the political costs of raising the taxes in order to fund those programs. Many of them they wouldn't do it. And as small government guys, we'll come clean to the audience. We hope that a lot of those programs do go away. But for the current argument is some of them are going to go away because the federal government is overextended, and that's unsustainable. That will end, and that will push fiscal stress to the states. And to cope with that fiscal stress, states that don't have a taxpayer bill of rights are going to need to add one, and states like Colorado that have them need to keep theirs and strengthen them, not weaken them, including with a budget stabilization fund that's pretty good sized. Many states have budget stabilization, but they're tiny, 3 or 4 or 5% of the ups and downs are often way more than that. 10, 15, 20% is maybe the cap, if any, on a budget stabilization fund. And then the carefully written capacity to pick up federally funded programs should the taxpayers of the state be willing to do so. And by I say carefully worded, we don't want that to become a giant loophole by which state spending can be expanded despite TABOR, but some states are going to want to pick up some of those federally funded programs, and that needs to not be a reason to not have a taxpayer Bill of Rights and limits on spending and taxpayer growth. They need to be able to consider doing that. And back to the federal situation, and several times I've said when the bond buyers get skittish, they're skittish already. Interest rates are rising. It's well documented that they're starting to worry about that we're in a spiral, and so this isn't hypothetical stuff where our grandchildren are going to be doing something. No, this is here and now, and could be very, very soon. It'll probably sneak up on us. Some external event will trigger something, and it'll be probably some sort of a domino effect to where we can't finance our debt. And if we look at the numbers, we're spending about a quarter of our federal revenue on debt service, paying interest. The other 3/4 is only barely enough for defense and Social Security and Medicare. So a lot of programs, that are funded now by debt are just not going to be able to be funded at the federal level. So the states need to start thinking about which of those programs they want to fund. So, for example, here in Utah, we've got a lot of national parks. Some of those may end up having to become state parks. I know that's sacrilegious, but as California, of all places, proved a few years ago, when you have to cut, you do figure out ways to cut things. And we're not quite there yet. So far, the feds won't even talk about cutting, which is another important reason why you viewers need to keep tuned into our Institute for Objective Policy Assessment, is because somebody outside the government has to be vetting and talking about and thinking about what to cut and when to cut it, because the elected representatives can't do that except at a very high political cost. If they suggest cutting anything specific, their opponent will just roast them to get that program constituency there. So I don't hear any federal representatives talking about specific spending cuts, and that's why, because they can't costlessly have those kinds of discussions openly, at least. Well, let's hope somewhere in a back room they're in secret discussing. I don't like government in secret, but that's the only place they can afford to discuss it. So we here at the Institute need to take over that, or some other institute. The other institutes, I pay a lot of attention to American Enterprise, and they keep showing the alarms. They keep ringing the alarms. All these terrible things are about to happen, but they're not doing anything, setting up anything to cope with the frenzy that will result when the bond buyers get skittish and it looks like they're going to back away from the spending, and then the Fed's going to look at, should we monetize more of the debt service? And of course, that means lots of inflation. It doesn't look pretty out there. And as you say, we're trying to figure out a way not to go over the fiscal cliff. That's another thing we're doing here at IOPA. But there also has to be a lot of discussion of, okay, so what happens if we do go over the fiscal cliff? We need to be able
I think we have a pretty dismal message today, but that's what it is. And I think that, as I mentioned in a future podcast, I want to talk a little bit about some of the innovations in direct democracy that I think hold some hope for addressing these issues. So We're not entirely pessimistic. I think there is some hope out there for improvements, but it's going to require citizens to get involved and to have the power to influence government through direct democracy. So I'll talk about that in the next podcast.
Yeah, that'll be huge because, as I just argued, our representatives are not going to talk about cutting. So we as the electorate, the people, need to talk about cutting and need to implement cuts. Because the representatives are just not courageous enough to even talk about it, much less actually do it until they have to cut. Again, a few years ago in California, the money wasn't there and they did cut. But other than circumstances like that, they won't. Wow, that was a lot of content there for 12 minutes. But Barry, we'll do this again next week.
Sounds great.